Let's come to you first and just pick out for us some of the salient points in the speech that you think are worth reflecting on now.
Well, the main thing we wanted to know is whether the Chancellor will put more flesh on the bones of his cuts proposals that were made in the pre-budget report. We knew in advance that he said actually most of that detail will come after an election, at some sort of spending round in the autumn if Labour are re-elected. But we also knew he'd give us a bit more on efficiency savings. The intriguing thing is he didn't tell us what those efficiency savings were. We're waiting for deep parliamentary announcements. But you go through this red book, Stephanie and Robert rather better at reading it than I am, but instantly you see that although he said the Department for Business will be doing more to help business, there's actually a saving of £230 million from their budget combined with the Department of Transport. Although he said the Department for Work and Pensions would do more to help young people, there's actually a saving in their budget of £475 million. Now, we can't tell you at this stage whether it's efficiency savings, whether it's cuts, what it is. We wait for those departments to spell it out.
OK, Stephanie?
Yeah, I think you had a whole plethora of announcements. He said it wasn't going to be a Christmas tree, but I guess, you know, the time of the year, it was some kind of an ornate Easter egg. But I think this question of the detail is crucial, because if you look at this book, and we will be trying to read, if not every word, then every word we possibly can, the overall effect of all these measures, and when you see them, you know, these things that all made a showing in the speech, all end up costing maybe 35 million here, 10 million there. They're quite small numbers by Treasury standards. The overall cost to him, the addition to borrowing in this year relative to what he would have had, is £1.5 billion, which compared to a nearly 170 billion deficit is not that large. I would say also, I was talking earlier about the structural hole in the budget and going forward, what was he going to do with borrowing? The city investors will be looking closely at that. We have, as expected, had an improvement in the underlying bit of the structural of the deficit, if you like, the bit that's not going to go away with the recovery. That's the bit that he's talked about cutting by 2/3 over the next few years. He said this time he used the language that the Conservatives have used. He was going to cut the bulk of it by 2015. The improvement in that picture has been almost all, well, 2/3 of it has been put into cutting the overall borrowing figure. So in a sense, if you're the city, you're going to say, OK, he had an improvement, the job was made a bit easier for him, and he's banked 2/3 of that, 1/3 he's used for these very sort of small sprinkling of sweeteners for everybody.
Robert?
Well, as we've just heard, this budget hasn't changed our basic view either of the government's finances or the outlook for the economy. A number of measures which look intensely political in my area of business, a lot of interventionism, support for business. The Labour Party will use that in the election to, they hope, to differentiate themselves from the Tories, who they will say the Tories will withdraw some of these tax props for business, for example. And so you can see the shape of the election campaign coming up. Now, we've referred already to the importance of the city reaction to all of this. The official borrowing figure has come down, but interestingly, obviously, for the city, what they are more concerned about is the specific amount that the government has to borrow in the gilts market. Now, that level has come down, that amount that they have to borrow from investors has come down much more sharply than the fall in the sort of net borrowing figure. The amount that the government needs to raise from selling gilts has come down to 187 billion. It's almost 40 billion lower than the current year. That is still, I have to say, a huge figure by all historical standards, apart from the year we're in, 187 billion. It's a huge amount to follow, but it's a movement in the right direction. And I would imagine that, if anything, gilt prices may rise a tiny bit. I don't think, we're out of the woods in terms of concern about the long-term prospects for our ability to borrow, but certainly it's a step in a direction that investors would like.
And that, in a sense, is the key political point about today. What the Chancellor was desperate to avoid was a statement that was instantly dismissed in the city and instantly dismissed by pundits as not credible, not serious about the deficit. If he is able to say, by not the end of today, but by the end of the weekend, really, there's a perfectly credible package. There's an argument about whether it should go further or faster or sooner, but it's perfectly credible to many people. He will regard that as a huge net political gain, because the Tories greatest strength is to be able to say there's a crisis and the government's in denial about it. They won't do what's necessary. If this is an argument about, no, there are two different ways, there are two different choices, there's two sorts of approaches, then what Labour will do is they'll take the measures they've announced today and say these they will claim are for the many and the Tories are for the few. That's why it's important today, he said, Labour would fund social care, but the Tories would cut inheritance tax. And that theme you'll hear again and again.
We'll have more in a second. Stephanie, we're just going to take some more reaction. I'll be back with you straight away after this because we'll be going to the City, we'll be going to Dudley too. But John Sopel is just outside Parliament for us with some guests there with some of the initial reaction. John.